Thanks, Samson. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Will Hawks, and as I've already been introduced to an extent, the insect migration scientist. I now work for Buglife and also do some work with the University of Exeter down here in the UK. And I'm going to start after showing you this lovely death's head hawk moth looking over on her migration. We're going to start by reading a little passage from the Bible, in fact. So this is from the book of Exodus 8:20, and this is from the Old Testament, so written about 3,500 years ago. And it goes, Then the Lord said to Moses, Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river and say to him, This is what the Lord says, Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies, even the ground will be covered in them. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into the Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by flies. The Pharaoh called Moses to him and said, Go, sacrifice to your God. And Moses answered, As soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not telling the people to go and offer sacrifices to our Lord. And then Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. And crucially, the Bible says, not one fly remained. And we think this is the earliest record of insect migration ever. So this is written down in the Bible of um, a huge fly movement. If there was a misidentification of mayflies coming out the River Nile, then their bodies would be covering the floor for days afterwards because they live for a little while, mate, and then die off. But because it says not one single fly remained, we can think of this as a great movement of insects moving through Egypt. And I did some work in Cyprus and along the same migratory flyway and saw millions of flies moving through there. And so this is, we think, the very first written record of insect migration 3,500 years ago. Right, let's move a bit forward to the first human records, way, way older than the 3,500 years old. So these are images from a cave in Font de Garme and Bernafal, which are caves in the Dordogne region of France, and they date to about 17,000 years ago. And they both show, they're only about maybe 10 kilometers apart, and they both show paintings of large mammals, such as the bison on the left and the mammoths on the right, and all over their bodies, they have pictures of or scrapings of moth or maybe dragonfly-like images. And this is really special because we think that quite a lot of the old human paintings and things were all based on importance to them. So the big movements of the big mammals, like the bison and the mammoths, would have been really important food sources in a given year. But also, what happens regularly is there's a huge movement of insects as well. So this could have been a site where they have lots of large mammal movements at the same time as huge numbers of insect movements. And we know from cultures in Australia, the First Nations people, they relied on the bogong moths to eat and to give them nutrients through the hot, dry summers. And so this could be the same thing. The moths could have been really, really important food source for early humans back then. And the numbers of insects are way, way bigger than what they are today. Although we still have examples. I don't know if you remember the Euro 2016 football final when it was France versus Portugal, and the lights in the Stade de France had been left on overnight, and they had attracted all of these moths, silver Y moths, to the ground, and they were covering the pitch and the players. And then, so this viewpoint of uh, insect migration through um, the eyes on cave paintings is a really fascinating thing. And here are some more. So 32,000 years ago, there's paintings of butterflies on the walls in France. And the closer you get to the Pyrenees, the bottom two places here, on the left, there's La Pasiega in northern Spain. On the right, there's Le Portel in southern France, right near where we did a lot of our research and saw a lot of hawk moths moving through the mountain passes. We see paintings of hawk moths in the caves tens of thousands of years ago. And again, these are areas which are really important. These are animals which could be really important food sources, and they could have been really abundant. So in the autumn, the people might have gone round and collected the hawk moths and things to eat because they're so full of fat. In 1493, this man, Christopher Columbus, went on his colonial way uh, across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, and he was off Cuba in 1493, and he writes in his diary about seeing the sea covered in sea turtles, so many that he could step on them and walk around pretty much. But then also the skies above being darkened by great yellow butterfly movement. And well, in fact, just before the 1950s, at the end of the Second World War in the UK, there was people stood on the cliffs of Dover looking out over the ocean, over the English Channel, and they saw huge numbers. Well, they saw what they thought was a sulfurous gas cloud rolling across this big yellow cloud. But when they looked closer, they realized that, in fact, it was a whole group of clouded yellow butterflies migrating to British shores. And this is really interesting because we don't see these huge numbers really anymore, especially not in Britain. And so seeing seeing these and having these records is really important because we now know how the baselines have shifted over time. And then let's continue with the early accounts of insect migration by going to the 1950s. And in October 1950, two ornithologists, David and Elizabeth Lack, went up to uh, the Pyrenees here, and they went up here to the Puerto de Bujarelo, the Bujarelo Pass, in order to watch the migration. And they were there and they saw huge, huge numbers of swallows migrating through the pass, like tens of thousands, all heading southwards um, to towards Spain in the autumn. They were there a bit longer and they saw loads and loads of butterflies coming through, lots of clouded yellows, lots of white butterflies as well, all heading west, southwest through the pass, low to the ground, battling the winds in order to get towards Spain in the autumn. But outnumbering the butterflies were the dragonflies, flying through, swooping through at least 10 times as many as the butterflies, moving the same direction. But it was only after being in the pass for about an hour did Elizabeth tug on David's shoulder and said, "Look at the floor." And the floor was covered in migrating flies. They caught a few of them, and here's me and Carl in the Pyrenees, my PhD supervisor, Carl Watson, catching these flies. And this is similar to what the lax would have seen. And they caught some, and they, after writing their paper in 1951, they realized that they were all marmalade hoverflies. And all of these tiny flies, as well as the other ones, their study made up the first insect migrant assemblage study in Europe. And they called the marmalade hoverflies the most remarkable migrants of all. These are tiny creatures migrating such long ways. And yes, as I mentioned, my name is Will Hawkes, and I'm currently working at Buglife, and I did my PhD at the University of Exeter, as well as a brief postdoc in the Swiss Ornithological Institute. And I've been studying these wonderful creatures for, wow, getting on to 6 or 7 years now. They're lovely, lovely things. And to understand more, let's now focus instead of the human accounts on the actual migration of insects. So let's go back in time and see how insect migration evolved. And insect migration has evolved in multiple times over the last, well, since they evolved 300 million years ago. The most recent time in Europe that insect migrations evolved was 20,000 years ago in the end of the last ice age. And this is because at the end of the last ice age, with ice sheets covering France and Germany, and there weren't very many areas where the insects could survive. And so they were all retreated to the glacial refugia, the areas where the ice wasn't there, so there was still food around. And within a population, you can imagine that if you went out of the population as an individual hoverfly, if you went too far, you just end up on the ice and you die off. And so it wasn't in the population's interest to be adventurous. And so the genes selected for were the ones which kept you in one place. But as the ice melted, the ice, the areas where the wildflowers could grow opened up again. And so if there was some genes in the hoverfly's bodies for adventurousness, then they go off and uh, they would find food further afield. And if there were areas where they had just melted, then that food would come with less competition, right? And so more and more this happened, and then those individuals which were more adventurous, they would get more, their genes would be selected for in the population. So over time, the migratory behavior evolved. And this is this is important because we think that the roots of these insects are still determined by the melting roots of the glaciers. We see it in birds, in wheatears, which I'll talk about in a second. But first, in bumblebees, we see bumblebees which migrate from England across the North Sea. Um, and they will follow the genetic, we think they might be following genetic memories of the land bridge, which was between Netherlands and the UK. And the bumblebees seem to still take that route. I've done similar studies with looking at assemblages in Cyprus and the Pyrenees and the Alps, and they all contain slightly different species. But when you are in the summer area, say in the UK, you have all of the species, but in the different areas, they all have different routes that they follow. So they could be following the ice sheets. Do I have my piece about? No, but I'll tell you the piece about the little wheatears. There's wheatear migration that goes from most of them go up to Northern Europe, and I'm sure you'll know this from Africa, but then some of them go all the way across to Alaska. And this is a population that goes all the way from Africa right up here, over here, to Alaska in order to, and then this population, this migratory route has persisted in their populations, probably based on the initial melting points of the ice. So this is insect migration. This varies, is slightly different to bird migration. If you imagine you're a swallow, you start up here in Northern Europe, you hatch, you have your children, you lay, and then you fly all the way south over winter and then fly all the way north again as a single individual. What a hoverfly or a dragonfly or a painted lady will do is in the autumn, you fly all the way south on a huge journey, and then you overwinter, lay eggs, and then your children will begin a series of migratory hops back up to the north when then there's a single sedentary generation again. And this is pretty cool because between every thing, they don't meet their parents. There's no experienced individuals to follow. So how they get there, the migratory information is passed on genetically, which is really, really fascinating. And the genetics of migration is super cool. So what this here is an early is a young a child of a marmalade hoverfly, and they eat aphids. And in the third instar, the third stage of development of a migrate of a marmalade hoverfly is when whether they're going to be migratory or not is decided. So they look up at the sky, they take in temperature information, they take in heat, they take in day length, and also food availability. And then they make this decision. And if all the thresholds are met, then they will become migratory species. And Toby Doyle here has worked out that there's over 1,500 genes involved in migration, which is really exciting. And these genes are really cool. So compared to the non-migratory individuals of hoverflies, the migrants are bigger, they're better and stronger at flying. They don't bother with reproductive organs, which is super cool because reprodu reproduction isn't an important thing when you're migrating. And so they will just not develop ovaries. It's pretty much just the females that migrate. Um, and they don't bother with developing ovaries. We think that they mate before they store the sperm and then they fly. And then it's only when they get to the area where they want to lay their eggs on the southerly or northerly tip of their migration, which they will then begin to develop their reproductive organs. These migrants are better at breathing at higher altitudes. They've got better vision and also they're less stressed, which is pretty funny. They have this gene that reduces signaling from the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. So they basically can push their cells harder without feeling the effects of stress. They're amazing things. So why do flies, why do insects, why do they migrate? What's the real driving force? Well, basically, the driving force is that they want to have more sex. They want to increase their reproductive baseline, their reproductive output. And they do this by exploiting seasonal habitats. So if you imagine here in the UK or across Northern Europe, in the winter it gets really cold. There are no wildflowers out. And so what the insects will do, they will want to migrate south to where there are loads of habitats. So they might migrate to the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa and where there's lots more food availability. And so compared to a solitary bee, for example, these migratory insects can breed all year round, and their movement is a trade-off for wanting to move all year round. And my supervisor, PhD supervisor, Carl Watton, he did a study where he showed that the the number of hoverflies moving into the UK increases by 4.5 in the springtime, increases by 4.5 times when they leave again in the autumn. So up in Europe, this is really important breeding grounds. And by the end of the autumn, or by the end of the summer, pretty much the only insects you're seeing are migratory individuals. Certainly around here, there's loads and loads of white butterflies and lots of red admirals as well, and as well as lots of moths and lots of hoverflies. And they're all amassing, they're getting ready to leave, and they are the most numerous individuals. Okay, how do insects migrate? Right, daytime insects, they have a sun compass, which is really cool. So my good friend, Dr. Richard Massey, did this study where he showed that hoverflies have a sun compass, this time-orientated sun compass, which they use, which is really clever because the sun moves across the sky during the day. We think that they assess the direction or they set the location of the sun, they calibrate their compass in the rising or the setting sun because they tend to migrate during the equinoxes when the sun's in the rising in the east, setting in the west. And then they're able to track the movement of the sun across the sky while maintaining the direction they want to go during that period. And um, Rich was even able to time shift these hoverflies, shift them 6 hours forward. And so that when he flew them again on the flight simulator, which initially showed them going southwards, when he flew them again, thinking that they were 6 hours further forward, they had also shifted their direction 90 degrees. So they, which is 6 hours on a clock phase, a 24-hour clock phase. And so they were going in the wrong direction because they thought it was a different time, showing that they've got an internal clock, which is really cool. And they've then recalibrated themselves when they could see the real sun again after being released. Nocturnal insects can't use the sun, but they can use the stars, which is really cool. So these bogong moths are amazing animals that migrate to and from the Australian Alps every single year. And they're different to a lot of other migratory insects because a single individual will go from the plains of Australia to the Alps, and then the same individual, after spending the summer sleeping off the hot weather, the same individual will go back again. So they're more like a standard migratory bird in this sense. And Eric Warrant, first they hibernate in huge numbers and they're really important for things like the pygmy possum, they rely on these movements of moths, and also the humans of Australia will um, certainly in the past rely on the movements of moths not only to eat but also to share stories and also um, uh, share genes as well. This was a real important melting pot for and meeting point for the First Nations people in Australia. The movement to capture and eat the bogor moths in the summer periods. And my good friend Eric Warrant has shown that the bogor moths have to know the patterns of the stars. And not only do they have to do one pattern, which helps them go towards the Alps in the spring, they need to then shift and know the other pattern for the stars because the stars will change shape as the Earth rotates throughout the year. So they need to know the constellations for going towards the mountains and then back again in different seasons. They're really, really special animals, little stargazers. But they also have another trick. So Eric again showed that these moths have a magnetic scent, which is really, really cool. And he was able to, he built this big whole laboratory with perfect conditions for the moths, but so it had trees and shrubs in there. It had a ceiling where he could project the stars onto, and he could show that even under a completely randomized star sky, where the moths wouldn't have a clue where to go, they could use, and then Eric could change the magnetic field of his laboratory, and he was able to show that the moths could then follow the magnetic field. And then if he shifted the magnetic field, the moths would go the other way. So showing with complete proof that the bogongs have a magnetic scent. And then he did something really cool to work out how they use the magnetic sense, and he filtered out the blue light. And when he turned off the blue light in the laboratory, the moths completely lost their magnetic sense. They didn't have a clue where to go. And this is because we think that the bogon moths use something called cryptochrome, a little molecule which is in their eyes, which is reactive to blue light and also the magnetic sense. So they may be able to see the magnetic sense, which is so cool. And we think this is actually quite different to how some birds do it because Martin Wachowski is just about to release a paper about magnetic sense in birds, which comes from their livers. So it's a real gut feeling of uh, the magnetic sense, whereas in these moths, at least they're using their eyesight to see what their magnetic senses are doing. Right. And this is a lovely quote from Eric. He says, "A bogong moth has the brain that's the tenth of the volume of a grain of rice and eyes the size of a pinhead. Yet they complete a journey if it were scaled up to human size, that's the equivalent of us circumnavigating the globe twice with nothing but our own senses to do so." Just incredible animals. Right. They also are really good at using favorable winds. Good friend Boya Gals, she showed that hoverflies, as well as loads of other insects, can actively choose their favorable winds. They've got these things called Johnston organs in their antenna just here, which helps them know wind direction. And of course, they're tiny things, but they can move as fast as birds because they can choose the favorable winds. And we think that spiders can probably do this too. When I was in the Pyrenees, we'd see the skies full of gossamer silk threads as the spiders were moving through the mountain pass on favorable winds. And it makes sense, right? The spider doesn't want to move to the north when it's migrating or when it's dispersing in the autumn period because then it gets too cold. What they will want to do is move towards the south. So we think that spiders may have a directional sense and may be migrating too, even though they don't have wings. Okay, let's go on to how many insects migrate. Here's a little video of flies moving across Cyprus, and you can see there's a lot of them. In 2019, I went to Cyprus. Here's Ted and here's Liv here, helping me out there. Boya was there as well as another researcher called Kate, sorry. And all the insects were flying at least 105 kilometers from Syria to Cyprus, from the east to the west in the springtime, heading into the rest of Western Europe. And but not just Syria. This is just the closest landmass. They are probably coming from Palestine, and they were coming from places like Iraq and all places around that area. And we counted over the course of only a little bit over a month, 38 million insects at a peak rate of 6,000 insects per meter per minute. On this day, we literally had to hide behind the car doors. There were just so many of these tiny insects. And some of them are really hungry as well. There are some called stable flies, which would little flies that feed on the blood of large mammals, and we were being eaten by them as well. Also, I've done a lot of work in the Pyrenees, the same pass that David and Elizabeth Lack went to, the pass of Bujarelo. It's about 2,275 meters high, about 30 meters wide. We did 4 years of systematic insect monitoring them. And this is what we saw. We saw loads and loads of flies moving through, um, which is really exciting. And this is how we counted them. We had a little video camera which would record for a minute every 15 minutes throughout the day. And then they'd scale it for the time and also the width of the pass. And then I'd go through and I'd count all the insects going through. And in the Pyrenees, there was 68 million insects across the 4 years, 17 million on average going through a 30-meter pass, remember, per year, just in the autumn, and about 3,500 insects per meter per minute at the peak. So these are really huge numbers. So yes, Pyrenees, 17 million insects a year. Cyprus, 38 million insects a year. And then, but these numbers get bigger. There's some really cool radar work done by Jason Chapman, and also Gao Hu and across southern England, and they showed that just across southern England, which is a um, pretty ecologically barren place, I must admit, they recorded 3.5 trillion insects over just southern England. And this is a huge number, especially if you think about the number of migrating birds globally. So across the whole world, there's about 5 billion uh, with a B migratory bird individuals. And but over just southern England, tiny area, there's 700 times as many insects. So we're kind of realizing just how important the numbers of migrating insects are. And then Jenna Florio looked at the nocturnal migrants, just nocturnal, across 1,000 kilometers of Mali in Western Africa. And she found that 2.5 quadrillion insects are moving across this kilometer stretch, which is absolutely wild. This is so many insects. That's 500,000 times the number of migrating birds across just one country. And this is just the nocturnal insects. The number of migrating insects globally is unbelievable. We really don't have a clue how many are moving total because our radars are not often powerful enough to count them. And a lot of what we're counting are really tiny insects. And I'm going to talk a bit about that now. So, what types of insects migrate? There's dragonflies, beetles, wasps, bees, moths, butterflies, hoverflies, other flies. This is a lovely little anthemiad fly, a bean seed fly, which we caught in their millions moving across the sea from Cyprus. And in the Pyrenees, we would catch these insects moving through with a Malaise trap, and a Malaise trap is something invented by René Malaise, a Frenchman, and he it's quite funny. He invented this pretty much purely to pick up girls. He thought that the if he caught lots of insects and named them after various women he'd met on his travels, that they'd be really impressed and fall in love with him. Um, and I got to admit, from experience, this doesn't always work. I feel that not everybody loves insects quite as much as I do. But yes, we catch the insects and identify them all. And in Cyprus and in the Pyrenees, in fact, we find that the flies are the most abundant things. 86% in Cyprus, 89% of the assemblage were flies. Way more than the Lepidoptera, only 1% the butterflies in the Pyrenees, 10% in Cyprus, which is the ones I thought would be the most numerous. But it's the flies which are the most important. Um, migrants. And we really don't appreciate that quite as much as I think we should. And even truly minuscule insects migrate. This is a Scava selenica, one of the pied hoverflies, tiny insects, maybe a centimeter or two long, and they have huge journeys through the Europe, perhaps getting all the way to Africa. But we all say they're tiny, but these are even more tiny. This is a grass fly, a Chlorophidae species, Ocinella frit probably, and they were migrating. They were choosing favorable winds to move through the Pyrenean Pass. This is an insect about 3 millimeters long. So there's so much moving. We need to do a lot of work taxonomically. Taxonomy is the most important element of insect migration research because without knowing what migrates, why are we bothering doing anything else? We need to know what migrates and how they, what impacts they have on the world. Okay, let's move on to how to track an insect. Um, in the 1960s, there was nuclear testing. I'll start off with a story by the French in Algeria, and they let off some nuclear bombs. And this man, Bernard Kettlewell, who is famous for the peppered moths, industrialization and industrial morph changing. So in the industrial uh, sort of cities, the black peppered moth form was more abundant because of the soot on the trees. And then in clearer areas, the white one was because for camouflage. But he was sat at his breakfast table reading about these nuclear testings in the 1960s. And he was like, I bet some moths are coming from Africa, but I don't know which ones. But he had a theory. So he put out in these entomological journals across Europe to send him species of silver wire moths, of rush veneers, of other migratory species. And he went over each moth he caught with a Geiger counter to assess um, their reproductive, not reproductive, their radioactive state. And he didn't find anything until he put a trap out in his Oxford garden. And in his trap was one of these, a little rush veneer moth. And he put his Geiger counter over it, and it suddenly went wild, click, click, click. And he looked closely under a microscope at this moth, and he could see this round circle, a piece of radioactive material. And he was able to carbon date or radioactive date this, and it showed that it was exactly the right age for the testings in Northern Africa. And so for this, he could show that the this little moth had come all the way from Africa, um, which is a journey of 1,500 miles. What's that? 2,000 something kilometers, um, between February the 6th and March the 10th. It's incredible for such a tiny insect, which is the very first long distance tracking of a moth. In my research, I've used satellite data to look at the vegetation index for insects moving. We were working in Cyprus and we looked at the vegetation index and was shown that in peak, where there's the most vegetation growth, this correlates very strongly with insect emergence. So we were thinking that this shows where the insects coming from Cyprus are. You can see that a lot come from Syria, probably a lot came from Iraq here, quite a lot from Saudi Arabia, maybe some from Iran, which is a journey of 1,600 kilometers, and then they continue into Western Europe. There's also isotopic research. So I'm sure quite a lot of you know how isotopic research works. Ellie certainly does. But as a brief overview, deuterium, if we're talking about hydrogen research, deuterium is a type of hydrogen element whose amount varies with rainfall. And then this can be mapped. And basically a hoverfly, their children will eat aphids, the aphids will eat the plants, and the plants take up water. And so eventually the amount of deuterium, the ratio of it persists in the adult hoverfly's wings. It's more complicated than this, but this is just a brief overview. And what Scott Clem did in America is he caught lots of hoverflies in Kansas, right down here. And then he looked at that isotopic ratio and he showed that all the Eupioides americanus hoverflies he was catching came from Canada up here, 3,000 kilometers away. So these insects are moving huge, huge distances. Miles Menz here worked with Martin Wikelski to put little VHF transmitters, very high frequency tags, on the backs of death's head hawk moths. And these have a little tiny battery, but they can only transmit about 15 kilometers. So what Miles did, where they got in a light aircraft and they followed the moths at night across Switzerland, um, and showed that they migrated at least 111 kilometers in the night, and they would continue down to, uh, well, probably continue down into Africa, which is amazing. And we're talking a lot about the route, so why don't we keep doing it? Here's a striped hawk moth looking over at Jebel Musa, the mountain on the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar here. And so this one had just migrated over in the springtime, to Europe from Africa. British insects, we think, are going based on NDVI, the vegetation index stuff. We think that the best place for British insects and insects across Europe to overwinter is actually the sub-Saharan Sahelian region of Africa. So a lot of the insects are crossing the whole Sahara Desert. I was talking to some friends that I made in the White Desert in Egypt, some Bedouin people, and they were telling me that every autumn they see loads of hoverflies moving with the migratory birds, um, across the eastern eastern Sahara, and the only thing south of the place where we were was about 1,500 kilometers away in the southern half of Sudan, um, which would be suitable for perhaps insects to overwinter. So these insects are moving huge distances. Here's a little representation of a fly going to Africa. I hope you all enjoy. Um, Globe skimmer dragonflies are amazing. They fly right across the Indian Ocean, 3,000 kilometers. They use the monsoon winds because they want to remain in the wet season, because they want puddles. And so they go all the way from India to Africa, and just to maintain the wet season, because in the puddles there are no predators, and so they need, um, so their children uh, can develop faster. And some isotopic research suggests that these dragonflies may actually not come from India at all. They may come from above the Himalayas. They may be coming from Siberia, even. A single individual might be going from right across the Himalayas. There's been lots of mountaineering expeditions seeing the dragonflies as they fly south, all the way to Africa. And I believe there's quite a lot of folk stories in Eastern Africa where the dragonflies are known as lucky because they bring the rains with them. And then I went to the Maldives, which is really cool. And on a lot of the dragonflies which are flying across the sea from the Maldives, we saw these little flies on the wings. And we're like, what are they? And identify them as Forsythia species, little midges that suck the hemolymph, the dragonfly blood from the veins of the dragonflies. And all of these dragonflies had just arrived from India. And they had these little dragon riders on their backs. Their feet stick to the membranes of the wings, and then they will fly, hitchhike, dragon ride across the Indian Ocean with in-flight meals. It's really just amazing. But also, these dragonflies are known from all around the world. These globe skimmers, they go everywhere. And some recent research from somebody called Jessica Ware collected uh, collected individuals from all around the world of these dragonflies, did the population genetics, and shown that they were all from the same population. It was a global panmictic population, including individuals she caught. She caught five individuals on Hawaii, and four of them hadn't come from Hawaii. So that basically means that if they hadn't come from Hawaii, they'd either come from America or they come from Southeast Asia. It's a huge distance. These insects, these dragonflies, are capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean on their migrations. It's so, so cool. And so the whole world is connected, in terms of their populations. And you might be thinking that insect migration is known from all continents except Antarctica, but in fact it's named from all continents, including Antarctica, because there's a little fly as well as lots of other moths, which were found on a subantarctic Marian island, including lots of pest species like scarce bordered straws. There was lots of here down here. There's Vanessa cardui, the painted lady butterfly, California chrysopalpis, a blowfly that migrates through here. Probably these insects are getting lost, but as the Antarctic region warms up, these are the ones which will be the first ones to arrive and then perhaps make more regular journeys to the low competition areas of the Antarctic, particularly from South America down to the Antarctic Peninsula. Okay, what time is it? Quarter two. We better keep going because we've got a little bit to get through. Impacts of the insects. So pollination is super important because migratory insects are probably better than bees at pollinating because they link geographically isolated populations of plants. And this allows spreading plant genes. So if we imagine a hoverfly has just arrived in the UK and is flown across the sea from Spain, and it was feeding on I don't know, fleabane or some maybe a rapeseed oil crop. And those crops in Spain have evolved resistance for drought. And so the hoverfly transfers the genes from that crop to the same species in the UK, transferring the genes for drought, for example, and this will allow for the UK species or Northern Europe species to develop resistance as well, which is really important because so then these insects can help fight against the climate crisis. Pest controllers are really important influence. Marmalade and Eupiodes hoverflies eat 10 trillion aphids in the UK annually. Just two species of hoverfly do this. There's loads of other species of hoverfly that eat aphids, so the number of aphids eaten is huge. Just 10 trillion is about 20% of the early spring aphid population. Decomposition, the breakdown of organic materials, is really, really important for migratory insects as well. Without migratory insects and a lot of insects, our world would be covered in poo and dead animals. And so what these things are doing is breaking down and turning them into nutrients. And it's been shown that just 50 female autumn houseflies, this creature, Musca autumnalis, the children of them, which is about 25,000 children, they lay a lot of eggs, can break down nearly half a ton if they were injected into a big vat of cow manure. They could break down nearly half a ton of it, just the young of 50 houseflies. This is remarkable because going through the Pyrenees, we would count about 1 or 2 million of these houseflies moving through every year. So if we take all of those houseflies and they all laid eggs, then their children could break down at about 13,000 tons worth of cow manure, which is really important because the faster cow manure is broken down, the less methane it reduces. So the reduction in global warming happens. But perhaps the most useful is nutrient transfer. So all of these migratory insects contain phosphorus and nitrogen, elements really, really important for plant growth. And they move in their trillions, their quadrillions, as we've seen. And when they get to an area they want to lay their eggs in, they'll lay their eggs and then they'll die off, which means that all the nutrients goes into the soil. And we think that across Northern Europe and probably across the whole world, the this nutrient transfer go into the soil really, really is important and it's regular and seasonal. So the plants might be relying on the arrival of migratory insects to to thrive. Larger animals rely on the migratory insects as well. A lot of migrating birds are insectivorous. And as I mentioned before, in the autumn and the late summer, the only insects left are the migrants because they're the most numerous. So things like swallows, like swifts, they're all feeding on these migrating insects in order to fuel their own journeys southwards. This is, of course, a Singaporean species, but I didn't have um, any local, any nice enough photos of birds here. Bats as well. We've showed that a paper we wrote showed that bats were actively relying on insects as they move through the Pyrenees. And in fact, one species of bat, the European free-tailed bat, has shifted its popping season, the time it has children, to the autumn because to coincide with the arrival of migrating moths, because this is the time when there's the most food. But insects are under threat, right? This is in last 50 years, 97%. There's been 97% decline in aphid-eating migratory hoverflies through a pass in Germany. And we think that this is the case across not just Europe, across the world. In the last 50 years in North America, insectivorous birds have declined by 2.9 billion, while non-insectivorous birds have increased by 26 million, showing that insects are declining and migratory insects are as well, especially the useful, really useful to humans ones like the aphid-eating hoverflies. And this is a really, really important thing. And because migratory insects, especially flies, could be the most important animals for the global ecosystem. And I'm not being superlative when I'm saying this. They really could be the most important animals. So much relies on them. Um, and even human cultural history as well. I'm a bit conscious of time, so I'm going to try and rush through. But the Day of the Dead festival, the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, currently runs for just 2 days, the 1st and 2nd of November, when the the dead return and they're remembered, and it's this beautiful festival of remembering loved ones lost. And the ground is covered in these, and everything's covered in these orange marigold petals. But when Spanish colonialists went there and they painted pictures and they wrote about Aztec and Mayan cultures, they realized that all the incense burners and the statues and things, and especially in the warriors going into battle and anything to do with death, there was these uh, uh, monarch butterfly motifs, these monarch butterfly symbolisms. And today in Mexico, my Mexican cousins were telling me uh, that it's very bad luck to ever kill a monarch butterfly because a monarch butterfly carries the soul of uh, a loved one who has died. And from the north, which is where the monarch butterflies arrive from, is the place of the Mexican otherworld. And this, in the Mayan and Aztec times, this festival used to last for 2 months, which is the period the monarchs are arriving. And today we've kind of lost this link, but the rivers of orange we see on the streets today probably mirrored the rivers of orange in the sky as the monarchs came back. And there's this memory which has kind of been lost. So the whole of the Mexican Day of the Dead festival probably has a monarch butterfly insect migration link. And it must have been quite comforting to know that even if you died, then you went to join this huge, mysterious family of migrating butterflies, which would have covered the now lost forests of Mexico. Okay, let's talk about conservation now. So, insect migration has a huge amount of threats. There's the climate breakdown, habitat loss, pesticide usage, and a lack of human understanding. It's really, really important that we understand how important these insects are and take an interest so we can help them. And linking habitats is crucial. We need to think global. It's not worth just creating a national park in Cornwall, where I am, to help migratory insects because these things are moving so far. We need to make sure they're safe across the whole world. And the Earth is a global ecosystem. If one part is sick, then the whole is sick. And this is something that is not currently spoken about enough in ecology, is that social justice is intrinsically linked to the climate justice. And I don't want to have to say about this, but it's it's actually so important. And I'm going to use the Israeli genocide on Gaza as an example right now, but this is the case for all wars. Um, it's released more CO2 so far than over 100 countries, and we know that global warming is really impacting insect numbers and bird numbers. And there's been a huge destruction of habitat from the bombing. And this is a hugely important migratory flyway. As I was saying earlier, all the flies coming from across Cyprus come through the Middle East here, the same as the ones which came through thousands of years ago, as written around in the Bible. So it's really hard to talk about this, but it's also so important that not only are we losing these habitats, losing uh, these this CO2, this global warming, but also we're losing the people that perhaps could be interested in helping these remarkable animals because they're just being killed by these horrible wars and genocides, which is funded by Western governments as well. And you have to talk about social justice when you talk about climate justice in today's world. Um, and so boycotting, protesting are the main ways to really make a change and help not only the people but the animals as well. And yeah, it's and losing all these people that could be so interested and help the help the migrants and everything as well. But yeah, there is a sunrise of hope. Insects have so many children that they can recover really quickly. And if we give them the chance, they will. And this could be, as I said, through boycotting, through this social justice, which is so important, but also eating organically if you can, encouraging governments, whatever, to plant more wildflowers, to give these insects, stop using pesticides. And I think the best way of doing this isn't by telling people off, telling people don't do this, but in fact, it's inspiring them. David Attenborough said, what you don't know, you cannot love. And that's so important. You need to spread the interest, you need to spread the love. And then if we do that, then I think working together across borders, insects don't care about borders, then we can work together to protect these most remarkable migrants of all. So thank you very much for everyone listening. And I'll take any questions. And sorry, it's gone on a bit long.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic. I